Imagine waking up tomorrow to discover that filling your gas tank suddenly costs far more than it did yesterday, not because demand exploded overnight, but because a narrow stretch of water thousands of miles away became the center of a geopolitical confrontation. That's the uncomfortable reality of today's world. 4 consecutive nights of U.S. strikes against Iran aren't just military headlines. They're raising deeper questions about strategy, diplomacy, and the economic consequences that reach far beyond the battlefield. The biggest story isn't only what was destroyed, it's what these decisions reveal about where this conflict may be heading and why the effects could reach every household long before the fighting ends. 4 consecutive nights may not sound extraordinary at first. But in international politics, 4 straight nights of sustained military action can redefine an entire conflict. That's exactly why this moment deserves more attention than a passing headline. Each new strike raises a larger question than the one before. Is this a limited operation designed to send a message, or are we watching the early stages of a much broader confrontation? Those are very different futures, yet the line separating them is becoming harder to see. For most people, this feels distant until the consequences arrive unexpectedly. Energy prices begin climbing, shipping routes become uncertain. Financial markets react before families even realize why everyday costs are increasing. What happens in one narrow stretch of the Middle East doesn't stay there. It travels through supply chains, fuel prices, investment decisions, and ultimately household budgets across the world. The pattern is equally important. Every military action has been followed by retaliation, and every retaliation has been met with additional pressure. That cycle has become the defining feature of this crisis. The longer it continues, the greater the chance that a conflict intended to remain limited expands beyond anyone's original calculations. Because sometimes history doesn't announce that a new chapter has begun. It simply starts writing it one night at a time. If you really want to understand why the world is watching this conflict so closely, don't begin with the missiles. Begin with the map. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway, but its importance reaches into nearly every economy on the planet. A significant share of globally traded oil passes through this corridor every day, which means even the possibility of disruption can trigger consequences far beyond the region. Markets don't wait for certainty, they react to risk. Shipping companies reconsider routes, insurers raise premiums, and traders price in the possibility that supplies could become more difficult or expensive to move. That's why every military development around this choke point is followed almost immediately by economic reactions. Those changes don't stay on trading screens for long. They work their way into transportation costs, manufacturing expenses, airline operations, grocery prices, and eventually the everyday budgets of families who may never have heard of the Strait of Hormuz before this crisis. What appears to be a distant geopolitical struggle can quietly become a financial burden felt thousands of miles away. And that's what makes this location so strategically significant. It isn't simply a narrow passage between 2 coastlines. It's a pressure point where military decisions and economic stability intersect. The question is no longer whether this waterway matters. It's how much uncertainty the world can absorb before the consequences become impossible to ignore. This is where the conversation becomes more complicated than simply asking who fired first or who struck harder. The central question is whether sustained military and economic pressure is moving the situation toward a diplomatic solution or making that outcome more difficult to reach. Supporters of a maximum pressure approach argue that increasing costs can eventually persuade an adversary to negotiate. Critics counter that governments under intense pressure may instead harden their positions, believing that backing down would project weakness at home and abroad. That tension matters, because every new round of action creates new incentives and new risks. If each response is answered with a stronger response, the cycle can become increasingly difficult to slow. History shows that escalation often develops through a series of decisions made in the belief that the next step will restore deterrence. Yet each step can also narrow the space for compromise. For people following these events from thousands of miles away, the concern is not only about military developments. It is about how prolonged uncertainty affects financial markets, business confidence, consumer prices, and global stability. When policymakers weigh strategic objectives against economic consequences, those decisions eventually reach ordinary households in ways that are often invisible until costs begin to rise. The real test of any strategy is not how much pressure it creates today, but whether it leaves a credible path to a more stable tomorrow. As military pressure intensifies, another battle is unfolding inside Iran, one that receives far less attention than missile strikes or satellite images. Leadership is being tested under extraordinary circumstances. Decisions now must balance national security, economic strain, domestic expectations, and international diplomacy all at the same time. That is an exceptionally difficult position for any government, particularly during a period of heightened regional tension. Every response carries consequences. A forceful reaction may reinforce the image of resolve, but it also risks inviting additional military pressure. A restrained response may preserve room for diplomacy, yet it can be portrayed by opponents as a sign of weakness. These are not simple choices. They shape public confidence, influence regional relationships, and affect how other governments calculate their own next moves. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens experience the consequences in ways that rarely dominate international headlines. Economic uncertainty, pressure on essential services, and concerns about daily life can become just as significant as developments on the battlefield. Governments facing external pressure must also manage internal expectations, and history shows that those two challenges often become deeply connected. For the rest of the world, this is more than an internal political story. The direction Iran's leadership chooses will influence regional stability, energy markets, and diplomatic efforts well beyond its borders. Sometimes the most consequential decisions are made not under calm conditions, but at the very moment when every available option carries significant risk. One of the biggest misconceptions about modern conflict is that it stays on the battlefield. It doesn't. Long before most people notice changes in the headlines, financial markets have already begun adjusting to new risks. Energy traders respond to uncertainty, insurers reassess shipping routes, and transportation costs begin to rise. Those shifts may appear technical, but they eventually reach something every household understands: the cost of everyday life. When oil markets anticipate possible supply disruptions, the effects move through the economy in stages. Fuel becomes more expensive to transport, businesses face higher operating costs. Airlines, manufacturers, and freight companies adjust their prices. Those increases can ripple through grocery stores, delivery services, and countless other goods that depend on reliable transportation. By the time consumers notice higher prices, the economic chain reaction has often been underway for days or even weeks. This is why geopolitical instability matters even to people with no direct connection to the region. Families trying to manage monthly budgets, small businesses balancing rising expenses, and workers concerned about inflation all become part of the story. Decisions made in military command centers can eventually influence financial decisions made around kitchen tables. The true cost of conflict is measured not only by events on the front lines, but also by the quiet financial pressure that reaches millions of people who never chose to be part of the crisis. One of the most important lessons in international affairs is that conflicts rarely remain confined to the countries where they begin. The moment military operations begin affecting neighboring airspace, shipping routes, or regional security partnerships, the calculation changes for everyone involved. Governments that initially hoped to stay on the sidelines suddenly face difficult decisions about protecting infrastructure, securing trade, and honoring existing alliances. That is why every report of disrupted shipping, intercepted projectiles, or heightened military readiness beyond the immediate area deserves close attention. Even when neighboring countries are not direct participants, they may still absorb economic shocks, face security concerns, or become involved in efforts to prevent further escalation. Each additional actor introduces new priorities, new risks, and new opportunities for misunderstanding. The result is a crisis that becomes increasingly difficult to contain. For people watching from abroad, the temptation is to see these developments as isolated events. In reality, they are connected pieces of a much larger picture. Regional instability can influence global energy markets, international investment, commercial transportation, and diplomatic relationships across multiple continents. What begins as one confrontation can gradually reshape decisions made in capitals far removed from the original conflict. The greatest danger is not always the first strike. It is the moment when one crisis quietly becomes many, leaving fewer paths back to stability than anyone expected. One of the hardest truths about international diplomacy is that agreements are often easier to announce than they are to sustain. Even when both sides appear willing to reduce tensions, lasting progress depends on continued trust, consistent implementation, and confidence that commitments will be honored. The moment that confidence begins to erode, every action is viewed through the lens of suspicion, making compromise increasingly difficult. That is what makes the breakdown of recent diplomatic efforts so significant. What may have started as an opportunity to reduce military tensions gradually gave way to renewed accusations, retaliatory actions, and competing interpretations of who violated the understanding first. Once that cycle takes hold, diplomacy stops being the primary tool for resolving disputes and instead becomes another arena where each side seeks strategic advantage. The consequences extend well beyond government negotiating rooms. Financial markets respond to uncertainty. Businesses delay investment decisions. Energy prices become more volatile. Families who have no influence over foreign policy still experience the economic effects through rising living costs and growing uncertainty about the future. History shows that diplomacy rarely collapses because of a single event. More often, it weakens through a series of decisions that gradually eliminate the confidence required to keep talking. When that foundation disappears, rebuilding it becomes far more difficult than preserving it in the first place. And once trust becomes the first casualty, every future negotiation begins from a far more dangerous starting point. When conflicts dominate the headlines, the focus often settles on military operations, strategic objectives, and political statements. Yet those headlines can overshadow another reality that is equally important: the impact on civilians whose daily lives are disrupted by events far beyond their control. Damage to infrastructure, interruptions to essential services, and prolonged uncertainty affect communities long after the immediate news cycle has moved on. When electricity networks, transportation systems, or water facilities are impaired, the consequences extend well beyond the original target. Families may struggle with interrupted services, businesses can face operational challenges, and local economies may slow as uncertainty grows. These effects are not always visible in dramatic images, but they shape everyday life in profound ways. This is also where the broader economic story becomes personal. Investors may evaluate markets, governments may debate strategy, and military planners may assess objectives, but ordinary people measure conflict differently. They measure it by whether they can keep their businesses open, whether essential goods remain affordable, and whether tomorrow feels more uncertain than today. Those concerns rarely appear in official briefings, yet they are among the most enduring consequences of prolonged instability. Understanding the human dimension does not diminish the strategic questions surrounding the conflict. It completes the picture. Every major geopolitical decision ultimately reaches individuals and families who had no role in creating the crisis, but must still live with its consequences. That is why the true cost of conflicts can never be measured by military outcomes alone. As the situation continues to evolve, it is easy to become overwhelmed by a constant stream of breaking news. Every statement, every military movement, and every market reaction can feel like the defining moment. But if you want to understand where this crisis is actually heading, there are three developments worth watching more closely than the daily headlines. The first is whether military exchanges continue to expand or begin to slow. A sustained pattern of retaliation could increase regional instability, while signs of restraint might create space for renewed diplomatic engagement. The second is whether additional countries become more directly involved. Every new participant introduces different security interests, political calculations, and diplomatic challenges, making the situation more difficult to manage. The third is whether meaningful negotiations re-emerge. History suggests that even periods of intense confrontation can eventually produce opportunities for dialogue, but those opportunities depend on political will and credible communication from all sides. These three signals matter because they influence far more than military strategy. They shape investor confidence, energy markets, international trade, and the economic outlook that affects households around the world. Decisions made in government offices today can influence prices, employment, and financial stability months from now. The future of this crisis will not be decided by a single headline, but by the direction these three indicators take over time. When we step back from the daily headlines, the most important question is no longer what happened today. It is whether these developments represent a temporary period of heightened tension or the beginning of a more enduring shift in regional dynamics. That distinction matters because short-lived crises and long-term strategic changes demand very different responses from governments, businesses, and ordinary citizens alike. History reminds us that major geopolitical turning points often become obvious only in hindsight. At the time, they can look like a series of disconnected events, one military operation, one diplomatic breakdown, one economic shock. Only later does it become clear that those events mark the beginning of a broader transformation. That possibility is why policymakers, financial markets, and international partners are watching each new development so closely. For families, the concern is far more practical. People want predictable prices, stable economies, secure energy supplies, and confidence that tomorrow will not bring another unexpected disruption. Businesses seek certainty before making investments. Workers look for stability in jobs and household budgets. Prolonged geopolitical uncertainty makes all of those goals more difficult to achieve. The challenge now is not simply responding to the current crisis. It is recognizing whether the decisions being made today are shaping a new strategic landscape that will influence global security and economic stability for years to come. Because the choices made in moments like this often define far more than the crisis that created them.